So many winning online poker players are confused about how to play here. Playing as big blind versus button, you check raise on king 9-4 with 5-4 suited. The turn comes at 10. What do you do here? What do you do on a 9? Over the past few weeks, I've asked a version of this question to many online regs, and I've received mixed answers. After watching this video, I want you to walk away with zero confusion about how to play these spots, and so much more. Having a solid baseline strategy here is so important because you're building a massive pot for the river. So let's learn together. Before we get to the turn, we have to start with the flop. We cannot learn solid turn play without understanding some basic concepts coming into the turn. And of course, this all starts with ranges. Most regs know that we should be raising around 15% of the time versus a flop c-bet. Exploitatively, it's important to check raise in order to win some extra EV by bluffing. More on that later. Now my question to you is this: should we check raise more versus early position c-bets or versus late position c-bets? If you answered versus early position c-bets, you're a little bit more correct, but it's actually quite close. As you can see, solver check raises around 11% of the time as big blind versus button, and around 13% of the time as big blind versus under the gun. Note that this is when we only ever use a large raise size. If we raise smaller, then we should raise more, which is where that 15% stat from earlier comes from. The much more important consideration is in position's c-bet size. Versus B75, playing big blind versus button, solver check raises only 7% of the time. If you've seen my previous video, you'll know that late position c-bets tend to be a little bit bigger. Be careful to not over-raise versus large c-bets. This is a mistake that many players make. Hey everybody, just quickly letting you know I'm doing 100% free database reviews for a very limited time. Almost certainly, this is the only time I will ever give away this much free value. I'm currently working on a coaching project and I need reg hands. So if you're an online reg and you play 100 NL or higher, send me your hand histories and I will give you a free database review. If you prefer, I can also pay you for those hand histories. To get this value, all you have to do is join the Discord and then DM me a photo of your graph. Thank you very much. Back to the video. To study the flop and turn a bit better, we can group the flops that we check raise on into three broad categories. Category A, high disconnected flops, Category B, middle connected flops, and Category C, paired flops. Our strategy on the flop and on the turn changes quite a bit with each category. On high disconnected flops, solver raises a polarized range with many weak pairs. On middle connected flops, solver raises many strong hands and draws. And on paired flops, solver raises some strong hands and many weak pairs. It's important to understand these categories broadly because play on the flop sets us up for play on the turn. From an exploitative point of view, it's important to understand the connections between the strategies on the flop and on the turn so that we know how to play on the turn should we deviate exploitatively on the flop. But more on exploitative poker later. First, let's discuss the Nash turn strategy. After we check raise on Category A flops, like king 9-4 rainbow, we'll often use a small overbet size on the turn. Solver likes to bet a polarized range, consisting of many strong hands and some bluffs. One crucial thing to note is that solver establishes a clear checking range here, and this is something that we'll see on most turns. On this board, the checking range comes from many weaker top pairs, like king 10, and some other weak pairs that raised on the flop. Because we're raising and then checking with a decent amount of middle strength hands on the turn, it's important to sometimes check raise with stronger hands like sets and two pairs as well. Check raise checking strong hands is also something that works very well exploitatively because many in-position players will overstab after we check. Sometimes the turn card will devalue our strong hands. On a 10 turn, for example, our opponent makes many straights. Our sets and two pairs get devalued, so the optimal bet size is a little bit smaller. Of course, one particular turn type that greatly devalues our strong hands is the flush closing turn. We'll talk about how our turn strategy changes there later on, but first, let's discuss our turn strategy on the other flop categories. After we check raise on Category B flops, middling connected boards like 9-8-6 flush draw, we often use a medium bet size on the turn. If we only use one bet size, we usually use B75 to B100. Again, we're betting a polarized range on many turns. Here, we have many straights and sets that bet. Our bluffs on the flop and on the turn mainly come from our strongest draws. We also arrive at this node with a clear checking range. Here, we usually check with many of our top pairs, and second pairs if we have them. One important thing to note about middling connected boards is that we tend to barrel a little bit larger on turns if we're playing versus an earlier position open. When we play as big blind versus button, we expect our opponent to open with many lower connected cards that interact well with middle connected boards. But if we're playing versus under the gun, then our opponent will usually lack these hands. They don't open weak hands like 8-6 suited from early positions. As a result, we'll usually have a bit more equity on these boards against early position opens and can bet larger on the turn. And lastly, before we discuss some exploits, let's have a look at our turn strategy after check raising on paired boards. After we check raise on these boards, our turn strategy and bet size varies a bit depending on the pair height. On low boards, we'll usually have a lot more trips than our opponent. Playing as big blind versus under the gun on 9-5-5 deuce, we arrive at the turn with a lot more 5x because our opponent does not open a lot of 5x preflop. As a result, we use a larger bet size on the turn. Again, we're betting a polarized range and form a clear checking range around our strong but not nutted pairs. On higher paired boards, like Queen 5 deuce, played big blind versus button, our opponent will have a lot of trips coming into the turn. In particular, our opponent will have a lot more strong trips than we do, and as a result, our own trips don't have too much equity. Because of this, they prefer to bet smaller. So on high paired boards, we can usually size down to half pot on many turns. There's one important exception to this rule, and it occurs when we play against an early position open. On the same board, Queen 5 deuce, played big blind versus under the gun, we actually bet big on the turn. This happens because under the gun's range is so strong coming into the turn that our weaker QX actually forms our checking range. So we instead prefer to bet a polarized range using a large size. In big blind versus button, weak trips prefer to bet small. In big blind versus under the gun, weak trips prefer to check. Now before we move on to some exploitative discussion, I first want to talk about those flush closing turns. So far, we've discussed the solver strategy on non-flush closing turns. On flush closing turns, the solver strategy is usually quite simple. It bets at a higher frequency for a smaller size. Looking at King 9-4 deuce flush closing, you can see this in action. Instead of using an overbet, solver prefers B25 and bets very often overall. Every hand class is betting at a high frequency, even former hands that checked, like weak top pairs. The reason for this is fairly straightforward, and I don't want to spend too much time here. But if you're interested in understanding why we use such a strategy on flush closing turns, leave a comment or reach out to me on Discord, I'll let you know. With that said, let's discuss some exploits. If we bet on the turn, we'll have the opportunity to barrel on the river. This is our check raise bet line. Versus a river barrel, the average low to mid stakes reg overfolds by about 4%. This river overfold does make intuitive sense when you consider villain's calling threshold. One common bet size used on the river is just all in, and versus this bet size, button should be calling many weak hands like second and third pairs. The data shows that there's a small river overfold here, which suggests that our opponents are not finding enough of these weak calls. This of course allows us to massively overbluff the river. One of my older videos, titled "Bluffing the River is Easier Than You Think," shows just how much we can bluff when our opponent overfolds. But although we can make more money by bluffing in this line, we actually shouldn't bluff incredibly too often on the flop or on the turn, at least in certain scenarios. This makes logical sense when you consider just how common the spot is. Played online, you'll be playing tons of heads-up single-raised pots, and you'll be check-raising the flop around 15% of the time. So over the course of just a few days, you'll be playing these spots incredibly often. Although it may be profitable to barrel on the turn after check-raising on the flop 100% of the time, you just can't do that. If you did that, your opponents would have a very easy time noticing that you're overbluffing, and they would counter-exploit you. If your opponent knows that you overbluff on turns and rivers, all they have to do is just overcall their top pairs to rip your strategy to shreds. So we should keep our aggression minimal in most common spots, unless we're playing live or just against a very weak opponent. This is just one of the concepts that I discuss over and over with my private coaching students. On the screen, you'll see the link to my website. My goal is to help you get to high stakes. You are so close to making it, and I know this because I was in your shoes not long ago. Check out the website and book your 100% free coaching consultation. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.